All right, so we will get started, and as people enter the room, that's fine. But I'm really happy to welcome Liz from the Western Retail Lumber Association. So we've been chatting a little bit about doing this presentation, and I'm so happy that she was able to join us today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Liz. And at the end, we do have time for questions directly for Liz and a bit of a roundtable discussion after. So thanks so much, Liz.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be able to work with you on this piece. Carrie-Anne and I first met a few years back while we were working on a Day on the Hill, and we were talking about the stress test. And I'm sure many of you agree that we would probably be rather talking about the stress test right now than all the issues that are currently going on in our industry. So I had reflections of that coming back. And just Carrie-Anne was really great. It was my first advocacy trip. She totally took me under her wing, and I'm really happy to be able to partner with her on some other projects as well to give back to some of the support that she had given me. So I have entitled this presentation, The Perfect Storm Continued. I've done a few of these presentations, and as much as I hate using the term perfect storm, it's one of those ones I'd like to burn once we get past this whole COVID piece. It truly does encapsulate what is going on in our supply chains. I don't think anyone really expected to see such a break and dysfunction in them, but we're learning how much we rely on each other in a global economy, and just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview on that. I've been with the WRLA for the past 4.5 years. Our association is like the home builders. However, we do support the manufacturing of building supply material companies, as well as the dealer market who distributes it to yourselves, as well as to the DIY market. Over the course of this past 1.5 years, we've been following all the different stories, and we'll be presenting some of the information that we have found today. So the objectives for today is to provide an overview of how we got to the lumber situation that we are currently in today. I also wanted to talk about some of the other current issues facing the industry, which are going to also impact a lot of your projects that you have on the go and future projects for the rest of the year. I also wanted to review some of the other product lines that are impacted and what has brought some of those factors on. And I also wanted to talk about or find out from you if there's an opportunity for us to be able to help your industry as well in terms of providing updated information. We certainly are here to partner with other groups and make sure that we can keep our economy moving forward and keep the communication lines open as well to provide better business. And then, of course, provide an opportunity for some questions at the end if you do have some. I will gladly answer any that you have. And if there are some that I can't, I will gladly take those offline and then provide an update following this call to make sure we can get you that information. So one of the things that Carrie-Anne had asked me to do was to provide a little bit of a timeline overview on the lumber piece. And a big reason why is because a lot of the issues that have brought us to where we are today are not necessarily things that have happened today. It's stuff from the past that's now haunting our current situation. So one of the key factors that has really impacted the curtailments and the availability of fiber in the marketplace is the mountain pine beetle. About 20 years ago, the mountain pine beetle moved from Alberta into BC, and it was creating a lot of issues. And timber supply, as you know, is managed very closely. It takes 65 to 80 years for a tree to grow to a harvest point. And when the mountain pine beetle had infested in BC, it started to create some problems. And the government had sanctioned a mandatory allowable cut, which is much higher than they typically would, as a salvage operation to make sure that that didn't continue to perpetuate. As a result of that cut, we lost 2 billion board feet of fiber from the market for obviously many years. And if we do the math, it takes 65 to 80 years to grow a tree. It's going to take a long time for that to recover back to that same supply. Then if you take a look at and fast forward to 2018, forest fires created more of those issues. And as I look back at the historical numbers, lumber pricing typically was fairly steady up until 2018, when there was a spike as a result of the forest fires. And of course now because of the COVID virus as well. And one of the other key factors that plays a role in lumber pricing is the stumpage fees, what mills, how that's calculated. I'm not sure if you have access to that information, but I'd be happy to share that with you. So when we were talking with some of the mills and trying to understand how we got to where we are today, the expectations for 2020 were really good. Lumber prices were low at the end of 2019. We expected to have a pretty solid year. Dealers had to submit their bookings. They already knew sort of what their products they needed for the all the lumber and building products basically dive off of a cliff, and demand for all products basically dove off of a cliff because of the uncertainty in terms of whether or not organizations were going to be able to function. There was forced closures as a result of the virus, just to make sure that they were containing the spread. And even back, think back to March, I remember speaking with some of our dealer community, and there were some really heavy-hearted conversations. You had businesses that were already moving into a pandemic, having 4 rough years in Alberta and Saskatchewan due to the oil and gas industry. And a lot of folks were a little uncertain of what that year would look like and were planning to close shop. However, that didn't happen, as we now know. But the mill closures did have an impact on the ability to produce product. Curtailments happened as a result of the lack of demand. And I even spoke with one of the smaller mills that supplies the Alberta region, just to talk to them about what they were experiencing in their region. And they had a full yard. People were not purchasing product, and they had to curtail simply because they just didn't have anywhere to store the material. And there wasn't enough space in their mill at this point in time. So once products started to move, they were able to resume their capacity. One of the challenges that the mills obviously faced as a result is the ability to work at full capacity. Because of the government regulations, limited employees were allowed in the plant at one time, and going from 2 shifts to 1 shift obviously had an impact. It's impossible to make up for that lost time that they were experiencing, and they needed to make sure that they were managing all those guidelines. And of course, there was a lack of trust in the market still, because people didn't know what was going to be happening. And I'm sure many of you, if you take a moment to think about it, there was probably a lot of hesitancy on your side as well. So in terms of the actual material supply, because the way that the commodity market is structured, a lot of the products need to be booked well in advance of spring. So that October, November area, dealers are putting in their bookings to make sure that they can get their materials dropped off in their yard come early spring, so that they can start mobilizing the projects that will start to ramp up at that time frame. So there was enough material to support that, but no one really expected the DIY market to explode as it had. And that really was catalyzed by folks working from home, the inability to travel, and having that disposable income to still be able to do things. And they decided, well, if we can't travel, then let's make our backyard the oasis. And I'm sure you'll recall there's a lot of pools were at a premium, and there is recreational vehicles, bikes, all types of those sort of products were unavailable simply because the demand was so high. The DIY market obviously created such a high demand that it outpaced the ability to supply. And as other projects started to ramp up across the country, because there were different closures, it was really tough for the mills to catch up on that. And some of them did actually have some fires. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but them trying to get caught back up meant that they were operating much longer than they would without doing their normal maintenance and without their cleanup, because they truly were trying to make sure that they were catching up. Obviously, it created a few delays in terms of the fires that needed to be fixed. So some of the other issues, just so you're aware, that impact the harvest process is weather really does have an impact on when logs can be taken out and harvested. And if it's really wet conditions, the trucks are unable to get in. That obviously creates further delays, and they're also traveling further to try and make sure that they can collect some of that material that they need in order to produce the product that will go to the end user. BC typically harvests throughout the year, but fires and the weather certainly do have an impact on that piece. The other factor that really came into play that caused a bottleneck last year is the transportation side. So even as the mills were starting to ramp up and make sure that they can get the product pumping out and out to market, the whole transportation piece became an issue, because obviously as the demand dove off the cliff, CN was furloughing some of their employees. You have the trucking companies who were furloughing their employees because there simply wasn't demand for all the product that typically would be transported. That obviously created some delays because it took some time to ramp back up. And when we were chatting with CN, we were asking what some of their challenges were. And the biggest thing for them was a lot of their employees are on collective bargaining agreements. They're unionized employees, which meant they had 15 days to report back when they received the call to go back to work. They had 15 days to be able to provide their go date, yes or no. And once they did actually come back, they needed to go through their safety training. So that added on another 2-week delay. And I'm sure you can imagine how that would trickle effect. Of course, that created delays in the yards in terms of unloading the freight, reloading the freight, and making sure that things are moving in a timely motion. It took several months for that to come back online. And a lot of the mills had to really look in working with various trucking companies to start the transport on their behalf, because they just needed to be able to get the product out so that they can continue to try and keep up with the demand. One of the other components of the trucking piece too is there was a lot of, and this may not have been so much in BC, as much of a problem in BC as it was further out east here in Manitoba, where I'm located, is with the lack of backhauls, it was really not enticing for the truckers to bring the lumber that would normally be transported by rail to this province. So it certainly created some shortages across the country as a result of that. And so where are we today? We obviously know that we're still stuck in this in this vortex of issues, and I think the tough part is really trying to forecast for the year. Towards the end of 2020, we did have a lot of conversations with several of our members, and we saw that the prices were starting to soften. Slowly, supply was catching up. And then all of a sudden in December, there was basically what a lot of our distributors called was panic buying, in terms of purchasing a lot of materials that they're trying to stock up on materials to make sure that they can move forward with their projects. And of course, we continue to go from there. Some of the raw material shortage impacts that we are seeing right now, which are obviously impacting more than just the lumber industry, but if we talk about the lumber piece, is the hurricanes along the Gulf Coast last year certainly took out a lot of the production of the resins that are required for OSB, plywood, and for other engineer wood products. And the freeze in Texas compounded that, because a lot of the processing plants, there was, I think, 160 resin plants that were taken out. And as of 2 weeks ago, 120 of them were still offline. So they're slowly getting caught back up. They had leaks they needed to fill. Obviously, they needed materials in order to fix those as well. So they're trying to get caught back up, and that's created havoc in a lot of other areas, because anything based with polyethylene, PVC, vinyl siding, vinyl windows, insulation are all now going to be impacted. There are delays that are being experienced, obviously price increases as a result of that, because again, supply and demand dictates that piece. Other products that are also on allocation and are experiencing some delays and will also see price increases is roofing. My understanding is steel has gone up more than 50%, and drywall, fasteners, etc., are all going to be impacted by that. And a large part of that comes from where we're actually sourcing those products. If they're coming from overseas, there are major container availability issues right now. So there are folks who want to be able to get their product. And I heard a story from one of our members who paid a premium to get their container to be prioritized. And even then, they can't guarantee that it's going to be on the next ship to come to Canada. So there's certainly a lot of issues there. And because a lot of the back containers that are going back, the back hauls are empty simply because of the lack of product that's being exported, is also creating price increases because they are going back empty. One of the other things we also learned recently is a lot of the containers that are used for adhesives and for sprays, those types of products that would be used in the finishing process. There's a limited amount of those because several of them have now been allocated to sanitizers and those types of products. So also creating a few issues on that perspective. So in terms of moving forward from here, one of the key recommendations that we've been hearing from our suppliers is it's really important to communicate with your key suppliers and your customers the situation that's going on. There's not a lot of time to be making decisions. And just to give you an example, back in January, I was chatting with one of my members who has a lumber store in rural Saskatchewan. He had a customer want to build a project. I believe it was a shed. provided him with a quote on the pricing in October, and obviously it was much higher than he was expecting, decided not to go through with it. And of course, in January, the situation got worse. And he basically said, well, why didn't you force me to go through with this project back in October? Well, nobody could look into the crystal ball and see what was going to happen. I think everyone expected things to change in 2021, and that hasn't happened yet. So we're still in Q5 and Q6 of 2020. We're really hoping that by the summer, July, August, things are slowly going to start to settle down. But the market is so volatile right now that everyone's so just some of the key recommendations: if there are known projects, they should be communicated to your suppliers as soon as possible so that they can make sure that that allocation is there. I know that there have been some concerns in terms of making sure that will continue. So I know that there are folks who set up a program with some of their suppliers just to make sure that they can continue to move forward with their projects and allocate that cash flow. Some folks have been making sure that signed letters of intent are coming from their customers to solidify the commitment, just to make sure that they can go through it. In the meantime, they lost their ability to access the actual materials for their project. So the key thing is being able to access the product itself. And then just consider some installment type options, layaways with the dealers that you work with on the supply side. Obviously, this has created a lot of challenges on the dealer perspective. The effects of price increases mean that they have an inability to hold pricing. We saw a letter from one of our dealers in Alberta who cannot hold their quotes for more than 2 days simply because the market has been so volatile. Obviously, it creates a lot of high emotions and impacting customer relations. So we've been trying to do our best to make sure that we're in the media and providing some of that education, because this really is no one's fault. It's a collection of a lot of issues that are out of our control to some extent. And customer price shopping has led to delays, which we just spoke about. The supply shortages are creating project delays, but the longer they're delayed, the longer they're going to take. And obviously, there's a lot of unknowns that abilities to information. First, the feeler segment of the supply chain, their bookings have been submitted. Allocations have been applied to a lot of the products for this year. They did need to put their bookings in at the end of last year. And I am aware that some of our members, they had ordered extra material knowing that they were probably only going to get a certain percentage of it. So some of them booked double what they would normally get just to be able to get the materials that they actually needed. And they're still running out of material because the DIY market is still so hot. Allocations have been applied on a lot of products. So as insulation, as roofing becomes available, those are being then sent on allocation. So again, it's really important for communication on what what need to leave out for dates and set in time as well. And we expect some utility for the half of this film. But in reading how the vaccination rollout in Canada is much slower than in the US and in other parts of the world, I think that might have changed the landscape a little bit, and they might mean that recovery will come later on in the year. But we will keep you posted if that's certainly something that you are interested in. And that's it for my presentation, because I really did want to leave some time for questions, but we are here to help. So if there's anything that you think we can do to keep you better informed, let me know. I'm happy to work with Carrie Ann in the office to make sure that we can get the information that you need. And I'm always here to answer any questions and look into, investigate certain issues that you may be having also on the supply side. So thank you so much for your time. And if you have some questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Perfect. So if you want, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to unmute and ask Liz as well. I'm just gonna open up the screen. While we're waiting to see if any questions come into the Q&A, do you want to do the FAQs, Liz?
Sure, absolutely. So throughout this past year, some of the questions that we've been getting is, what is the government's position on mandating a portion of timber harvested on Crown land be made available to the Canadian market? And there is no appetite from the government's perspective on this because of the trade agreements that we have in place, both provincially and at a federal level. And when it comes to the lumber and forestry products piece, we're very much a North American market and not a Canadian market. And the American market is significantly larger than the Canadian one. So obviously, them purchasing our products is really great for the GDP. It can be a challenge in times like these when there are material shortages. One of our mills to address this issue has been working to ramp up their productions in the US as well. So this past year, they were able to increase the amount of product distributed through Canada by 16 to 17%. So there certainly are efforts to make sure that the Canadian market can get the material that it needs. The other question that we often get as well is from an advocacy perspective, is it possible to reopen the closed mills? And the answer to that has been no, because where those mills are located, there's no longer products available there. There's no more fiber in those region in order to process it. So until that area can be replenished, the option to reopen some of those mills is not possible. And the transportation to transport from various areas of BC to that area will make it unfeasible to do that as well. The other question that we get is it possible to increase the annual allowable cut? And again, the government has responded to that because the forestry industry is natural resource. Boom and bust doesn't work for sustainability, so it's not something that is in the cards now, but it is certainly something that is being looked at for not necessarily in our lifetime, but in 2080, hopefully they'll be able to increase some of that as well, just because of the time frame it takes to grow those trees. And the outlook for 2021 we already touched on. So
Perfect.
okay,
Looking to see there doesn't look like there's any questions in the Q&A function.
okay.
Oh, look, we do have one.
Okay.
The shortage of materials is bad enough, but the double and triple prices are crippling, particularly on fixed price contracts. So I guess that's more to the general sense of what's going on right now. Do you have a comment on that, Liz?
So when you say fixed price contracts, is that what the home builders have with their clients, or just so that I can understand that? Is there force majeure has been called on a lot of force majeure has been put into place with a lot of the product lines simply because the production sites are unable to hold that pricing. I would double check to see if I haven't seen one of your contracts, but my recommendation would be to check and see if there is force majeure in those contracts. And if not, it might not be a bad idea to start looking at that as an opportunity moving forward. I know that might not help now, but in terms of moving forward, force majeure means you can't hold that pricing. And here's the inflation that will need to take place as a result of natural disasters. Do you have force majeure in those types of contracts?
I think some, it expanded a little bit. Like we have fixed price contracts, CCDC, I think that's 2 I's, on new residential projects.
Okay.
And then force majeure does not apply to COVID-19 any longer, as it is now a known issue.
What about from the natural disaster perspective? Because a lot of the material shortages now are created by the natural disaster.
And I think because we looked at this like about a year ago, we were talking quite heavily about force majeure, and it did help for some, but it looked like things were going into place that once COVID was known, you couldn't pull out of a contract or couldn't change things based on COVID. But to your point, this isn't directly, I mean, there's a COVID-19 impact certainly happening, but there's a lot of other issues at play. So I'm not sure.
Well, it would be worth I could send you some of the bullet points of the various things that have happened, and this is even just coming from the actual plants themselves, stating this is where we're at, here is why we're not able to produce the resins, etc., because that obviously impacts OSB, any sheeting that you need. So, and that's a big component of it. And now with some of the finishing products, it's also the same issue. So that's not COVID-19 related, that is Mother Nature related.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you want me to send some bullet points on that, or?
That'd be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just from a legal perspective, it might be worth taking a look into that a little further.
And one of the things that we've heard with the price increases, that because they've been so significant, it's knocked people out of their borrowing power.
Yeah.
So depending on what stage of construction you're at, like we had a horrible story of a member, they'd already kind of done foundation and they've gone far enough, but then the prices changed so dramatically so quickly that it knocked the home buyer out of being able to finish the contract.
And that's an issue. That is a piece that's also an impact for the dealers, because the product costs are so significantly higher that they're not able to make their dollar go as far as they used to. So it's creating an issue for them as well on that perspective. Now, has there been any discussion with, have you had any discussion with BDC or any other banks to see if there's a solution there?
We had BDC, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic. It might be good to bring them back. And I'm sure, I think it all depends on the level of housing that we're talking.
Well, also BC is kind of in that bigger bubble too, right? So even more of a challenge.
Yeah, sure. And then there is a question here that I can answer. So this will be recorded and will be sent out. I know that answer. Do we have any other questions for Liz? Just looking here.
Maybe would the class on today find it helpful to get regular updates on the building material situation? If yes, I'll be more than happy to work on that.
I think so. There is another question here. Will the government step in to balance the amount of product that is available to the Canadian market?
Okay. So, good question. I actually had a meeting 2 months ago. We had a call with Minister Carr. Is the special representative for the prairies. As you know, the federal government doesn't have any seats. No representative were voted in from the prairie provinces. So he is the point of contact that we have. We did talk about the shortages, and he wanted me to reach out to him to have additional discussion about it. I have followed up, but we haven't had any conversation. I don't know. I don't think they're going to make any changes. And the way that the way that we have trade agreements, they are not going to support protectionism of products staying in Canada, because they want to make sure that there's that back and forth ability. I think there's a fear that other product lines are also going to start getting cut off. And we saw what happened with the previous administration in the US with the irrational tariffs that were happening. I don't think anybody wants to get back into that type of situation. But what some of the mills are truly trying to do is ramp up their operations in the US, whether it's building new facilities, taking over old facilities that haven't been used, so that they can better supply their marketplace and therefore increasing more of the product that's in Canada. Not the greatest answer. I know it's not the answer that everyone wants to hear, but in speaking with government, there really is no appetite at this point to put that protectionism on.
Okay, perfect. The next question we have, the price increases in BC have been 2 to 3 times increased over the last 6 months. Is this the same price happening in the US?
Yes, they're being impacted the same way as everyone else because of the shortages, and they're seeing the exact same increases, whether it's on the insulation side, they're impacted by the resin as well. So much product that's being manufactured get manufactured in Canada. There's obviously operations in the US, as well, but we're seeing the same thing, and we are experiencing a lot of the same things. A lot of the suppliers, whether it's on the roofing side, are struggling to get the materials they need in order to continue their production. So this is an issue across both borders.
Do we have any other questions for Liz? While we're waiting for them to pop up, to what frequency do you send? Because you're doing the same report that we were talking about for Chris in Saskatchewan, right?
You know what? I haven't been doing it yet, but I will be sending it to her as well. I wanted to find out a little bit before we went ahead and started putting that out there. We wanted to just double check and make sure that this would be helpful to your organizations, and the consensus is yes. So we are going to start distributing this provincially.
Perfect. And then to what frequency do they follow, or would they follow?
Well, that kind of depends on you. At this point, I think weekly updates might be best in terms of the volatility of what's going on, because things do change very quickly. So if 1 week is good for you, then we would be happy to do that. We just want to make sure that the timing is relevant. There's such digital overload right now that I just want to make sure that that's not too much for you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think with how quickly things seems to be changing on this side of it, the weekly would be beneficial.
Okay. Then I will, Mondays, is that typically sort of a good time frame?
Sure.
Start of the week? Okay.
Mondays is perfect.
Great. Then we can at least report back on any updates we receive at the end of the previous week.
Okay. And I know we chatted a bit about it, but could we expand a bit on the outlook for 2021? Like I know when you had done the update with Kevin Lee and National, how much has changed since then, do you think?
Well, the situation has for sure gotten worse since then. There's no question. The whole, I don't think anyone expected the freeze in Texas to have such an impact, and it has. I believe that presentation was in January. We're now at the beginning of April. Things have changed drastically, and especially on all the other product sides as well, where insulation, there was one of our members had 5,000 leaks in their plant, and they're responsible for a lot of polyurethane production, anything that goes into the insulation, vinyl for windows, and they needed to rectify those before they were able to get back to operating. So we certainly are in a worse situation than I think we were in January, just because of the shortages now of the resin that's required to create so many other products. And it's not just lumber now that's being impacted, it's so many other product lines. You're looking at steel, and I don't know how much steel studs are used from your perspective, but I know that there's going to be challenges on the siding side as well, and roofing, in terms of, for some companies, they have enough supply. It's going to come down to what colors are available. And I think maybe right now that might not be the biggest concern. It's more about, can we actually get the material, and where are we going to be at? Steel has gone up by 50%. And my understanding is there's another increase coming again, simply because some of the raw materials they need for the galvanization process are also at a premium and very hard to get right now as well.
Perfect. So the question, he's considering purchasing large amounts of lumber now. If the prices are going to continue to go up, do you have a better understanding of the future?
It's tough to say. I think no one is really interested in, I think everyone's afraid to make any predictions, because the downside risk of this is it could be real, and we don't really know when that's going to happen. Based on the reports that we've been seeing, recovery in Canada is going to take longer because of the slow vaccination rollout that we are experiencing. That's something that we're following on a regular basis, and can start to include in the update as well. It's certainly important in terms of purchasing product because they are dollars a sheet, and then all of a sudden the price plummets to 20. That's a big hit that they're going to be having to take financially. So I know that that's a risk that everyone's has at the back of their mind right now, but we still are not able to keep up with the demand in terms of supply.
Perfect.
I hope that answered the question as best as I could without that crystal ball.
If only.
If only.
Do we have any other questions for Liz? Just checking. Not looking like we have any in the box. Oh, the crystal ball would be great.
Yeah. If I had that, I'd be living on an island in Tahiti with a no trespassing sign.
Exactly.
Wishful thinking to travel right now.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, if we do have any questions, we can forward them to you.
Absolutely.
Get back to us. That would be great. So I want to thank you so much for your time today. I do have